The stranger in Crestwood. The small town of Crestwood wasn't the kind of place that took kindly to strangers. Nestled deep in rural America, it had a reputation for being close-knit and isolated, the kind of town where everyone knew each other's business and change was unwelcome. It was a town of deep traditions, tight-lipped neighbors, and long memories, especially when it came to people who didn't fit in. For Elijah Moore, a CIA undercover agent, Crestwood was dangerous territory. His mission was simple but critical: infiltrate the town under the guise of a mechanic and investigate a suspected extremist group planning to destroy the town's only bridge, a strategic act of terror that would sever Crestwood's connection to the outside world. If the plan succeeded, the town would be cut off, isolated, and thrown into chaos. Worse, the attack could ignite a nationwide movement of domestic terrorism. Elijah's mission was to stop it before it started. He had done undercover work before, but this time was different. This time, the enemy was wearing badges. Arrival in Crestwood. Elijah drove into Crestwood just before sunset in a battered 1978 Ford F-150, its rusting frame and rattling engine making it blend in with the other aging vehicles of the town. His cover was airtight. His identity was that of an ex-military drifter, looking for work and a quiet place to settle down. A new mechanic at the local garage was the perfect disguise. No one paid attention to the man under the hood of their car. But as he rolled into town, he immediately felt the weight of watching eyes. People paused mid-conversation as he passed, their stares cold and unreadable. The diner went silent, its patrons peering out through the windows as his truck rumbled past. At a small gas station, an old man chewing tobacco spat onto the pavement and muttered something under his breath. Elijah was no stranger to suspicion. A black man in a small, overwhelmingly white town. That alone was enough to make him an outsider. But there was something more here, something beneath the surface. Something was wrong in Crestwood. The garage. Elijah pulled into Bill's auto shop, a modest, grease-stained garage at the town's edge. The owner, Bill Tucker, was a gruff, beer-bellied man in his late 50s with thick arms and a permanent oil stain on his overalls. He was skeptical at first, squinting at Elijah with thinly veiled distrust. But when Elijah offered to work on commission, Bill grunted and gave him a nod. "I'll give you a week," Bill muttered. "You screw up, you're gone." Elijah nodded. Fair enough. Bill's assistant, Tommy Grayson, was different. A lanky, freckled 19-year-old, he had the boundless energy of a kid too eager for excitement in a town that never changed. "You ever work in a place like this before?" Tommy asked, watching Elijah jack up an old Chevy truck. Elijah smirked. "More than you'd think." Tommy grinned, already intrigued by the mysterious newcomer. Elijah could tell the kid would be full of questions before long. The first few days at the garage were uneventful, at least on the surface. But Elijah was always observing, listening, piecing things together. The town was on edge. A town with secrets. Elijah started noticing patterns. People whispered when they thought no one was listening. Men gathered in small groups late at night, speaking in hushed tones before dispersing quickly when someone approached. A black SUV rolled through town every morning at dawn, disappearing toward the outskirts. And then there was the bridge, a massive, aging steel structure that connected Crestwood to the highway. Elijah could feel the importance of it. Something was happening in this town. The most chilling clue came on his fourth day. While grabbing lunch at the diner, Elijah overheard two men at a nearby booth whispering. One of them, a burly man with a shaved head, muttered, "It's happening soon. If he ain't with us, he's against us." Elijah pretended not to hear but took mental notes. They were planning something. But who was he? The sheriff. The first time Elijah met Sheriff Nathan Hayes, he knew the man was trouble. Hayes was tall, broad-shouldered, and imposing, with cold blue eyes that held a quiet malice. His uniform was pristine, his belt polished to a shine, his gun always visible on his hip. A man who liked control. and didn't take kindly to people who didn't fit into his idea of order. "You're the new mechanic," Hayes said, stepping into the garage one morning. Elijah wiped his hands on a rag. "That's me." "We don't get many drifters in Crestwood," Hayes said, eyes narrowing. "Hope you ain't planning on sticking around too long." It wasn't a warning. It was a threat. Elijah met his gaze, offering a calm smile. "Just here to do my job." The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Then Hayes smirked, a slow, knowing expression, and turned to leave. "I'll be keeping an eye on you." As soon as he was gone, Tommy let out a low whistle. "Man, you really got under his skin," the kid muttered. Elijah exhaled. That was the problem. Because Sheriff Nathan Hayes wasn't just a small-town cop. He was part of something bigger, and Elijah was now a threat. A town divided. The pressure builds. For the next few days, Elijah felt the weight of Crestwood's scrutiny pressing down on him like a slow-building storm. The town had already been wary of him, but after his encounter with Sheriff Nathan Hayes, the hostility intensified. The glances weren't just cautious anymore. They were watchful, calculated, threatening. Even Bill, the garage owner, who had initially been indifferent, seemed to grow uneasy. He wasn't an unkind man, but he wasn't the type to stand up against the tide either. He kept his head down, focused on business, and didn't ask too many questions, but Elijah could see it in his eyes. He felt the tension too. It wasn't long before the harassment started. One morning, as Elijah pulled into work, he found his truck's tires slashed. Deep, deliberate cuts, all 4 of them. Tommy was the first to notice. "Jesus, man," he whistled, crouching beside the ruined tires. "Somebody really don't want you here." Elijah stared at the damage, his jaw tightening. He expected this. He'd been in dangerous situations before. But this wasn't a foreign battlefield. It was small-town America. And this type of hostility was different. It was personal. That night, it escalated. After a long shift at the garage, Elijah locked up and started walking back to his small rented apartment above an old bakery. The town was eerily quiet. The only sound was the occasional creak of a porch swing or the distant hum of a passing car. Then, footsteps. Faint. Measured. Elijah's instincts flared to life. He was being followed. He kept walking, his body tensing. He didn't turn around. Not yet. If they thought they had the element of surprise, he could use that against them. The footsteps quickened. Elijah spun around. A shadow lunged at him. The attack. Elijah moved on instinct, ducking just in time to avoid a swinging wooden bat aimed at his head. The attacker, a stocky man in a dark hoodie, stumbled forward, thrown off balance. Elijah seized his moment. He drove an elbow into the man's ribs, knocking the air from his lungs. The man grunted in pain but recovered fast, swinging the bat again. This time, Elijah caught it, yanked it free, and slammed the butt of it into the man's knee. The attacker collapsed with a pained cry, rolling onto his side. For a moment, Elijah thought it was over, until he saw movement in the shadows. 2 more figures stepped forward. One of them, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, smirked. "Didn't think you'd be that fast, outsider," he sneered. Elijah exhaled sharply. His heart pounded, but he kept his breathing steady. 3 against 1. Not great odds. He tightened his grip on the bat. If this is how you welcome newcomers, no wonder your town's got a bad reputation. The scared man chuckled, rolling up his sleeves. "You don't belong here, boy. Best learn that now." The last word barely left his mouth before he lunged. Elijah sidestepped, swinging the bat, striking him in the ribs. The man cursed, staggering back. The third attacker, a wiry man with sharp eyes, charged in next. Elijah braced himself. But then, flashing red and blue lights flooded the street. A sharp voice barked, "Step back. Hands where I can see him." The sheriff. The setup. Within seconds, Sheriff Hayes and his deputies, Tyler Gray and Connor Evans, emerged from their patrol cars, guns drawn. The three attackers immediately threw up their hands, as if they were the victims. Elijah, still gripping the bat, took a deep breath. This was bad. Hayes walked forward, his expression unreadable. What the hell is going on here? One of the men, the one Elijah had hit first, groaned from the ground. He attacked us, he gasped, clutching his ribs. We was just talking to him. Then he went crazy. Elijah's eyes narrowed. That's a damn lie. And you know it. Deputy Gray took a step closer, his hand resting on his gun. So what? You expect us to believe you weren't involved in anything more? Evans snorted. Ain't it funny, Sheriff? Trouble seems to follow this one around. Elijah kept his face impassive. This was a setup. They weren't here to help. They were here to make sure he took the blame. Hayes folded his arms, staring Elijah down. You carrying a weapon? Elijah gritted his teeth. They wanted an excuse. No, he said firmly. The sheriff tilted his head, unconvinced. Check him. Evans smirked, stepping forward, patting Elijah down roughly, his fingers pressing harder than necessary, like he wanted to provoke a reaction. Nothing. Evans scowled. He's clean. Hayes sighed dramatically. Now see, this is the problem. We got good, hard-working folks here saying you assaulted them. Elijah laughed coldly. Good, hard-working folks. You mean the ones who just tried to jump me? The tension thickened. Hayes held Elijah's gaze for a long moment. Then he smiled. Let's take a ride, he said. Wrongfully arrested. The handcuffs snapped around Elijah's wrists. It didn't matter that he was the victim. It didn't matter that he had been attacked. In Crestwood, the law belonged to men like Hayes. The ride to the sheriff's station was silent, except for the occasional snickers from Deputy Evans. You must really love trouble, Evans muttered. You keep pushing like this, you ain't gonna like how it ends. Elijah stared ahead, refusing to take the bait. They pulled into the small, dimly lit police station, and Elijah was dragged inside. They didn't process him. They didn't take his statement. Instead, they threw him into a cell and left him there. No phone call. No lawyer. Just silence. Outside the cell, Sheriff Hayes leaned against the desk, smirking. See, the thing about Crestwood, he mused, is that we take care of our own. And you ain't one of us. Elijah met his gaze without flinching. I've dealt with worse than you, Sheriff, he said quietly. Hayes' smirk faltered for just a second before he pushed off the desk and strode toward the exit. You sit tight more, he said over his shoulder. Ain't nobody coming for you. The cell door clanged shut, the metal ringing through the empty station. Elijah sat on the hard bench, his mind racing. He had come here to investigate extremists. But now he knew. The sheriff was one of them. And he wasn't going to let Elijah leave Crestwood alive. Trapped behind bars. Elijah sat in the cold, dimly lit jail cell, his wrists still sore from the too tight handcuffs. The sheriff's words echoed in his mind. Ain't nobody coming for you. His fingers brushed against his side, where his ribs ached from the earlier attack. His leg tensed, still sore from the struggle. He forced himself to take slow, steady breaths. He had to stay calm. He had been in worse situations before. Captured overseas, held hostage by cartel gunmen, stuck in war zones where the wrong move meant death. But this was different. This was home soil. This was America. And here he was, a trained CIA agent, thrown in a backwoods jail on trumped-up charges, with a corrupt sheriff standing between him and the truth. A town that doesn't forget. Outside the cell, Sheriff Hayes stood at his desk, leaning back in his chair, arms folded across his chest, his smirk never fading. His deputies, Gray and Evans, were nearby, laughing like this was some big joke. So more, Hayes said, rocking his chair back on two legs. You come into my town, start sniffing around where you don't belong, and then you have the nerve to fight my boys in the street." Elijah said nothing. "See, what you don't understand is that Crestwood ain't like the cities you're used to," Hayes continued. "Out here, we handle things a little differently. Out here, we don't forget." Elijah met his gaze without fear, without anger, just quiet, unwavering defiance. "You mean out here, you and your boys get away with whatever you want," Elijah said. Deputy Evans snorted. "He's got a mouth on him, huh?" "Yeah," Gray muttered. "Maybe we should teach him a little respect." Elijah felt the weight of their eyes on him, but he didn't break. "You want respect?" he asked, voice even. "Then start acting like lawmen, not a damn street gang." Silence. Then Hayes chuckled, shaking his head. "You got guts, more. I'll give you that." His smile faded. "But guts won't save you. And if I were you, I wouldn't be so damn confident. You see, people in this town, they trust me. I say you're guilty, then you're guilty. You could rot in that cell for weeks, months, even years, and no one outside Crestwood would even know you were here." Elijah felt his stomach tighten. This was what power looked like when it had no oversight. This was corruption, deep and unchecked. And Hayes wasn't lying. If the CIA didn't realize he was missing soon, he really could disappear. The only hope. Elijah leaned his head against the cool, hard metal bars, his mind working through the possibilities. Who could help him? Tommy? The kid had a good heart, but he wasn't experienced enough to take on men like Hayes. Bill? Unlikely. The old mechanic was too scared to stand up to the sheriff. Then there was Kara. She was sharp, she was observant, and more than anything, she hated Hayes. If anyone could get the word out, it was her. Elijah knew he had to reach her. But how? That was when he heard the front doors of the station swing open. Footsteps. A familiar voice. "What the hell is going on here?" "Kara." Elijah sat up straighter, straining to hear. "You arresting people now, Sheriff?" Kara asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Hayes didn't answer immediately. "Stay out of this, Kara," he finally said. "I'm making this my business," she snapped back. "What's the charge?" "Assault," Gray muttered. Kara let out a sharp laugh. "Oh, that's rich. The same guys who attacked him are out walking free, and you throw Elijah in a cell. You think people don't see what's happening here." "You'd do well to watch your mouth," Hayes warned. "No, you'd do well to watch yours," she shot back. "You forget, Sheriff, I hear everything that goes on in this town. You really want me talking?" A dangerous silence followed. Elijah smirked. She was getting to them. Kara had a way of digging her nails under people's skin, pushing just hard enough to make them sweat. "You don't want to start making enemies, Kara," Hayes said slowly. "Oh, but see, I already have enemies," she replied smoothly. "I just make sure mine don't outlive me." The escape plan. Elijah knew that Kara couldn't break him out. She wasn't armed, and she wasn't stupid enough to fight 3 cops in a locked police station. But she could do something better. Get the word out. She needed to contact the CIA. Elijah stood and spoke loud enough for her to hear. "Kara," he called. She turned, stepping closer to the bars. "You okay?" she asked. He gave her a look that said, "We don't have time for games. Do what you need to do." She nodded, a tiny movement, almost unnoticeable. Elijah felt a spark of hope. Kara was on it. A long night. After Kara left, the sheriff and his deputies went back to their usual routine, drinking coffee, watching TV, laughing amongst themselves. Elijah sat in his cell, waiting, and waiting, and waiting. Hours passed. The station was quiet now, too quiet. Then, footsteps, coming toward him. Elijah tensed. The sheriff stood outside the bars, a dangerous glint in his eyes. "You're not as smart as you think, Moore," Hayes muttered. "You're not walking out of this town." Then his hand went to his holster. Elijah's blood went cold. Was he really going to? Bang! The sound shattered the silence. For a split second, Elijah thought Hayes had shot him. Then he saw the bullet hole in the cell wall. A warning shot. Hayes smirked. "See, I'm a fair man. I don't like shooting folks unless I have to." He leaned in closer. "But the thing is, Moore, you keep sticking your nose where it don't belong, and one day, you ain't gonna be fast enough to dodge the next one." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Elijah alone in the darkness. Elijah exhaled slowly, steadying himself. He wasn't afraid. No, he was angry. He had fought too many battles, come too far, to let some small-town tyrant break him. And what Hayes didn't know was that Elijah wasn't alone anymore, because Kara was out there, and she was about to bring hell down on Crestwood. When justice comes knocking. The town sleeping in darkness. Crestwood lay under the heavy weight of midnight silence. The town's streets were empty, the only sounds being the occasional bark of a distant dog or the rustling of trees in the wind. Inside the sheriff's station, Elijah Moore sat in his cell, watching the weak glow of the streetlights filter through the barred window. The pain in his ribs throbbed, his leg was still stiff from the fight, and his mind was working in overdrive. He had two choices: wait and hope that Kara was fast enough to bring help before Sheriff Hayes decided to deal with him permanently. Create his own escape. The second option was risky as hell, but Elijah had spent his entire career getting out of situations like this. He looked around, taking in every detail of the small-town jail cell. The bars were old, thick, but rusted. The walls were cinder block, and the lock on the cell door was basic, cheap, probably hadn't been upgraded in 20 years. Elijah smirked. Amateurs. But before he could act, he heard muffled voices from the front of the station. Then, a knock at the door. Kara's Gamble. Sheriff Hayes, sitting at his desk, turned toward the front entrance. His deputies, Gray and Evans, had been playing a lazy game of poker, but they stopped immediately. "Who the hell is that at this hour?" Gray muttered. Evans rolled his eyes. "Probably just some drunk looking for trouble." Hayes didn't look convinced. Something in his gut told him otherwise. He stood and moved toward the door, resting his hand on the gun holstered at his hip. Knock. 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 More insistent this time. He unlatched it, swinging the door open. Kara stood there, arms crossed, her face set like stone. Hayes narrowed his eyes. "You lost, sweetheart." "Cut the crap, Sheriff," Kara said, stepping inside without waiting for permission. "I know what you did to Elijah." Evans groaned, rubbing his temples. "Not this again. You shot an unarmed man, arrested him without cause, and threw him in a cell while the real criminals walk free," she continued, voice sharp. "You're making a mistake." Hayes shut the door behind her, stepping forward slowly, towering over her. "I don't make mistakes," he said, voice low. "And you should watch your mouth before you say something you regret." Kara smirked, not backing down an inch. "That's funny," she said, "because the FBI seems to think you made a big one." The room went still. Deputy Gray's head snapped up. Evans stopped mid-drink. "What the hell are you talking about?" Hayes growled. Kara reached into her jacket, pulling out her cell phone, turning the screen toward them. The live feed showed a black FBI vehicle speeding toward Crestwood. "Looks like I made a little phone call," she said. "Turns out, the federal government isn't too happy about you locking up an innocent man." She smiled sweetly. "They'll be here in 10 minutes. The breaking point." Hayes' face darkened. "You really think they're going to help him?" He sneered. "You think a couple of suits care about some outsider? About you?" He gestured toward Elijah's cell door. "By the time they get here, he'll be long gone." Kara's stomach dropped. Hayes turned to his deputies. Take him out back. Elijah, still seated on the cell's thin mattress, knew exactly what that meant. They weren't planning to let him walk out of here alive. Evans grinned, cracking his knuckles. Been waiting for this. Gray unlocked the cell door and stepped inside. Elijah sprang into action. The escape. The moment Gray reached for him, Elijah grabbed his wrist, twisted hard, and yanked him forward. The deputy stumbled, losing his balance. Elijah took the split-second opening, elbowed Gray in the throat. The deputy gasped, staggering backward, clutching his neck. Evans lunged next, pulling out his baton. Elijah ducked. The baton whizzed over his head, smashing into the wall instead. Elijah countered with a hard kick to Evans' knee, sending him sprawling. Hayes drew his gun, but Kara reacted faster. She grabbed a paperweight from the sheriff's desk and hurled it straight at him. Crack. It smashed against Hayes' temple. He stumbled, cursing, his gun clattering to the ground. Elijah didn't hesitate. He grabbed Gray's baton, flipped it, and slammed it into the sheriff's ribs. Hayes hit the floor, coughing. Evans tried to get up. Elijah kneed him square in the face. Blood sprayed as the deputy collapsed unconscious. Kara, breathing heavily, looked at the chaos around them. Elijah wiped his brow. We need to move. Now. Running out of time. They burst out of the station and into the night air. The FBI convoy was minutes away, but Elijah wasn't about to wait around. Where's your car? He asked Kara. 2 blocks down, she said. Elijah limped forward, his injuries slowing him down. Then, a gunshot. The bullet whizzed past Elijah's ear, barely missing. Hayes was at the station entrance, blood trickling down his forehead, gun raised. Kara grabbed Elijah, pulling him into an alley. That son of a, she hissed. Forget him, Elijah gritted out. We just need to hold out a little longer. When the feds arrive. Then, sirens. Blinding headlights flooded the street. Black SUVs skidded to a stop in front of the sheriff's station. FBI agents poured out, weapons drawn. Sheriff Hayes, still holding his gun, took one look at them and dropped it. Sheriff Nathan Hayes, put your hands where we can see them. Hayes slowly raised his hands, his jaw clenched in rage. Evans and Gray, still groaning on the ground, were immediately handcuffed and dragged to the cars. An FBI agent in a suit, Agent Daniels, approached Elijah and Kara. Elijah Moore, Daniels asked. Elijah nodded. Daniels looked him up and down. You're lucky she called when she did. Elijah exhaled. Yeah, I know. Daniels turned back to the agents handling Hayes. Get these bastards locked up. I want a full interrogation tonight. As Hayes was dragged past, he sneered at Elijah. You think this is over? He spat. Elijah smiled. Oh, I know it is. Hayes struggled, but the cuffs stayed tight. Get him out of here, Daniels ordered. As the sheriff was shoved into the back of an SUV, Crestwood's reign of corruption ended. The town wasn't perfect. It had a long way to go. But tonight, justice had finally come knocking. And thanks to Elijah, Kara, and a well-timed call, it knocked the door down. The collapse of a corrupt sheriff. Elijah leaned against the cool brick wall of the alley, breathing heavily. The adrenaline was still coursing through his veins, keeping him upright despite the searing pain in his ribs. Kara crouched beside him, peering toward the sheriff's station, where the FBI agents had taken full control. The town that had once turned a blind eye to Sheriff Hayes' corruption was now wide awake. People had stepped outside their homes, drawn by the sirens, the flashing lights, and the unmistakable sight of the once untouchable lawman in handcuffs. Agent Daniels, standing with a few other operatives, eyed Hayes as he was forced into the back of the black SUV. You got a hell of a lot to answer for, Daniels muttered. Hayes didn't speak. He kept his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with undiluted hate as he stared at Elijah. This ain't over. Elijah pushed off the wall, despite the pain, and limped toward the SUV. He stopped just short of the door, staring down at the man who had nearly ended his life. "You got too comfortable," Elijah said. His voice was calm, measured, the voice of a man who had already won. "You thought you could do whatever you wanted, keep this town in fear, decide who mattered and who didn't. But the problem with being untouchable is..." Elijah leaned in slightly. "Someone always finds a way to reach you." Hayes' jaw tightened, his lips pressing into a thin line. For the first time, Elijah saw it, true fear, because Hayes knew what happened to people like him in federal custody. He knew that whatever he had been a part of, whatever deals, whatever bribes, whatever dark secrets he had been protecting, the feds were about to crack them wide open. Daniels nodded to the agent, holding the SUV door open. "Get him out of here." The car slammed shut, and the convoy peeled out, carrying the fallen sheriff and his deputies toward their fate. Crestwood was no longer under their control. The unfinished battle. Kara crossed her arms, staring after the flashing lights. "You think that's the last we'll hear of him?" Elijah smirked. "Nah, guys like him. They always think they can claw their way back. But he's got a long road ahead, and I doubt he's ready for it." Daniels turned his attention to Elijah. "You did good, but you should get checked out. You look like hell." Elijah exhaled sharply, rolling his shoulders. "Been through worse." Daniels studied him for a moment before nodding. "We've been tracking this extremist network for months. We knew they were planning something big, but we didn't have a way in. Your intel on the bridge saved a lot of lives tonight." "So, what happens now?" Kara asked. Daniels adjusted his jacket. "We clean up the mess. The warehouse is being raided as we speak. Every piece of evidence more collected is going straight into federal custody. Once we unravel the rest of their network, we shut them down for good." Elijah felt the tight knot in his chest finally loosen. It wasn't just Hayes. It wasn't just the sheriff's department. The real problem, the extremist group behind the planned attack, was being torn apart at the roots. But there was still one loose end. Who was running the group? Elijah asked. Who was giving Hayes his orders? Daniels glanced at him. "We'll find out soon enough." But Elijah had spent years chasing ghosts like this. He knew it wasn't that simple. Whoever was behind the group wasn't going to disappear quietly. And Crestwood, for all its faults, was still a battlefield. The town watches. The townspeople began to emerge, stepping into the streets. They whispered among themselves, their eyes flicking between Elijah, Kara, and the cluster of FBI agents. Some still looked at Elijah with distrust. Others, particularly the younger crowd, looked at him with something new. Respect. Tommy finally arrived, pushing through the small crowd. His face was flushed, his hair a mess, but he looked at Elijah like he'd just seen a damned superhero. "Man," Tommy breathed, shaking his head. "You took down Hayes. You actually took him down." Elijah gave a tired shrug. "Wasn't just me." Kara smirked, nudging him. "Don't be modest. You did most of the ass-kicking." Tommy grinned, but then his face turned serious. So what now? The town had lived under Hayes' rule for years. People had accepted his corruption because they believed they had no other choice. But now, the sheriff's station was empty. There was no power structure left. Elijah glanced at the station's dark windows, then back at the watching crowd. "Now," he said, voice calm, "you decide what comes next." Crestwood wasn't just free from Hayes. It was free to choose its own future. The question was, would it? One last goodbye. Hours later, as the sun began to rise over Crestwood, Elijah stood near his truck, watching the golden light stretch across the horizon. He knew his time here was over. The town's fate wasn't his to decide. His mission was complete. Kara leaned against the truck beside him, sipping a steaming cup of coffee. "You could stay, help make sure this place doesn't fall apart." Elijah chuckled. Not my style. She sighed. Figured you'd say that. Tommy walked up, stuffing his hands into his pockets. Where you headed? Elijah looked down the road, the open highway calling him away. Wherever I needed next. Tommy grinned. Well, you ever need a mechanic, you know where to find me. Elijah clapped a hand on his shoulder. I'll keep that in mind. Kara hesitated for a moment, then pulled something from her jacket pocket. A small folded note. What's this? Elijah asked. Just something for the road, she said. You're not the only one with a few secrets. More. Elijah took the note, sliding it into his pocket without opening it. Guess I'll find out eventually. Kara smirked. Safe travels, CIA boy. With that, Elijah climbed into his truck, turning the key. The engine rumbled to life, filling the quiet street with sound. As he drove away, he caught one last glimpse of Crestwood in his rearview mirror, a town that had once been drowning in fear and corruption. Now, it had a fighting chance. And that was more than enough. The ghosts of Crestwood. A road that never ends. Elijah Moore didn't look back as he drove out of Crestwood, letting the cool morning wind rush through the cracked windows of his truck. The sun had barely risen, casting a golden glow over the quiet fields, stretching endlessly on both sides of the highway. The town was behind him now. Hayes was in federal custody. His deputies were gone. The extremist network planning to destroy the bridge had been shattered before they could act. It should have felt like a victory. But Elijah had been in this business long enough to know that just because one snake's head was cut off, it didn't mean the body was dead. There was always another enemy lurking in the dark. And right now, he had unfinished business. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the small folded note Kara had given him before he left. His thumb brushed over the paper for a second before he flipped it open. Inside, in quick, slanted handwriting, was a single line. Crestwood was only the beginning. Follow the money. Elijah's grip tightened on the wheel, because he knew exactly what that meant. A new target. The FBI had swept through Crestwood like a storm, cleaning up the corruption, rounding up suspects, and shutting down the extremist cell. But if Kara was right, if Crestwood was just a small piece of a bigger puzzle, then someone higher up the chain had been pulling the strings. And they weren't going to stop. Elijah pulled off the highway, parking outside a dusty roadside diner. It was one of those places that smelled like burnt coffee and old grease, where the waitresses had been working there for 20 years and could tell if you were troubled just by looking at you. Elijah walked inside, choosing a seat by the window. He ordered a coffee, black, no sugar. Then he pulled out his phone. The screen lit up, and he scrolled through his secure messages until he found the one he was looking for. A single name. Victor Langley, a former military contractor, ex-Black Ops. Now an arms dealer who had made a fortune selling weapons to rogue militias, extremist groups, and corrupt officials worldwide. Elijah had come across Langley's name several times during his investigation in Crestwood. Whispers of weapon shipments, money transfers, encrypted messages coming from out of state. If Crestwood had been just one of his testing grounds, then that meant there were others. And Langley was still out there, pulling the strings. Elijah took a slow sip of his coffee. He needed to find Langley. Kara's warning. Before he could start digging deeper, his phone buzzed again. A message from an unknown number. You should have stayed out of it. Elijah's pulse didn't spike. His breathing didn't change. He had been in this game too long to be rattled by anonymous threats. He tapped out a response. Come and stop me. A few seconds later, a reply. You're already dead. Elijah leaned back in his chair, rolling his shoulders. Is that so? Before he could respond, the diner's front door creaked open. A man walked in, tall, military posture, short cropped hair, dark sunglasses. He wasn't here for the food. Elijah watched the man from the corner of his eye, noting the bulge of a concealed weapon under his jacket. Whoever had sent that text message, They had just sent a hitter after him. The assassin moves. Elijah kept still, sipping his coffee like he didn't have a care in the world. The man didn't sit down. He went straight to the counter, ordered a coffee, then turned to scan the diner. His eyes landed on Elijah. He smirked. Then, he reached inside his jacket. Elijah moved first. He kicked the table forward, sending the man stumbling backward as the coffee mug shattered against the floor. The assassin yanked his gun free. Elijah was already on him. His fist connected with the man's wrist, twisting the gun away. The weapon clattered onto the floor. The assassin swung hard, but Elijah dodged, grabbing the back of the man's neck and slamming his face onto the counter. Crikey! The diner erupted into chaos as people screamed, shoving past chairs to get away. Elijah grabbed the assassin by the collar and dragged him outside. Interrogation on the pavement. The hitman was dazed, blood dripping from his nose. Elijah threw him against the side of a parked car, pinning him in place. "Who sent you?" The assassin grinned through bloody teeth. "You already know." Elijah slammed him against the car harder. "Say the name." The man coughed, laughing. "You think taking down one dirty sheriff in a backwater town changes anything? This goes higher than you, more." Elijah's grip tightened. "Where's Langley?" No answer. Elijah pulled the man's gun from his waistband and pressed it against his knee. "You got one chance," Elijah said quietly. The assassin's grin finally faded. He licked his bloody lips. Albuquerque. Elijah's mind clicked into place. Langley was in New Mexico. Before Elijah could press further, the assassin lunged. Elijah stepped back and fired once. The bullet buried itself into the man's shoulder. He screamed, collapsing onto the pavement. Elijah crouched beside him, speaking low. "You tell your boss I'm coming for him." Then he walked away, leaving the assassin writhing on the ground. The hunt begins. Elijah didn't hesitate. He climbed into his truck, started the engine, and peeled out of the parking lot. New Mexico. That was where Langley was hiding. Crestwood had been just a testing ground. But now, Elijah was going to end the real threat. He tapped out one final message before putting his phone away. "Langley's next." The reply came seconds later. From Kara. "Then let's finish this." Elijah pressed down on the gas pedal, his truck roaring forward onto the open road. The battle in Crestwood was over. But the war had just begun. The final hunt. The road to war. The desert highway stretched endlessly ahead, the heat shimmering in the distance like a ghostly mirage. Elijah's truck cut through the New Mexico landscape, the tires rolling over cracked asphalt, kicking up dust. He had been driving nonstop since leaving Crestwood, stopping only to refuel and sleep in the truck's cramped cab. Now, the final destination was in sight. Albuquerque. It was different from Crestwood. Larger, busier, a city that swallowed people whole. The perfect hiding place for a man like Victor Langley. And yet, despite its size, Elijah knew one thing. Nowhere was safe when he was coming for you. His phone buzzed. "Kara, I'm in position. You're not gonna like what I found." Elijah's grip tightened on the wheel. He wasn't expecting to like it. A city with shadows. Albuquerque was a place of contrast. By day it was bright and sprawling, a city built into the desert's bones. By night, it belonged to ghosts. Elijah navigated through old streets, past warehouses covered in graffiti, abandoned gas stations, and neon-lit motels that never turned off their signs. He finally pulled into a small diner, a discreet meeting place where Kara was waiting. She sat in a corner booth, stirring her coffee, her expression tense. Elijah slid into the seat across from her. "What do you have?" She pushed a manila folder across the table. Elijah flipped it open, and what he saw made his stomach turn. Langley's operation. The folder contained dozens of surveillance photos. Victor Langley, sitting in a private booth of an upscale restaurant, shaking hands with a state senator. Langley at a weapons auction, exchanging briefcases full of cash. Langley leaving a military base. But the worst photo, a shipment of crates, each one marked with government tracking codes. Each one full of weapons meant for the U.S. military, but sold to domestic terrorist cells instead. Elijah's jaw clenched. He's supplying them directly, he muttered. Kara nodded. Crestwood was just a test run. He's been arming extremists across the country. Military-grade weapons, stolen, repurposed, and sold under the table. Elijah closed the folder. This wasn't just a man funding a terrorist group. Langley was the war machine itself. And if he wasn't stopped, Crestwood would be the first of many. The final play. Elijah took a breath. Where is he now? Kara checked her watch. He's holding a meeting at a private airstrip tonight. He's got buyers coming in. Elijah smirked. Perfect. Kara raised an eyebrow. You're seriously planning on taking on an entire private army by yourself? Not by myself. He slid his phone across the table, showing her a message he had sent earlier. To Agent Daniels, FBI. Langley is moving weapons at a private airstrip. Send a team. This ends tonight. Kara leaned back. And if they don't show up? Elijah smirked. Then we do it the hard way. She sighed. Why do I get the feeling that's the only way you know? The airstrip. The airfield was isolated, sitting on the outskirts of Albuquerque. The runway stretched long and dark, the perfect place for illegal business. Elijah and Kara parked a distance away, using binoculars to scan the area. There were at least a dozen men patrolling, several SUVs, and in the center of it all, standing next to a private jet, was Victor Langley. Even from a distance, he looked like power. Tall, clean-cut, sharp gray suit, expensive watch. The kind of man who looked more like a billionaire investor than a war profiteer. Elijah handed Kara a pistol. Stay sharp, he said. She rolled her eyes. Oh, I was planning on it. The takedown begins. Elijah crept through the darkness, moving between cargo crates and vehicles, getting closer to the meeting. Langley was talking to his buyers, laughing, shaking hands, sealing another deal in blood. Elijah counted the guards. Too many. If the FBI didn't show, they were badly outnumbered. He reached for his phone to check for updates. And that's when everything exploded. The ambush. Gunfire erupted. The airstrip lit up in chaos as black SUVs stormed in, agents spilling out with automatic weapons. FBI raid teams. Langley's men scrambled, shouting as they fired back. Langley whirled around, trying to flee to his plane. Elijah broke cover. He moved fast, dodging behind a crate as bullets whizzed past him. Kara was right beside him, pistol drawn, firing precise shots at the guards. Langley's jet revved its engines. He was trying to take off. Elijah wasn't going to let that happen. The chase. Elijah sprinted forward, weaving through the chaos. Langley was already on the stairs to his jet, his guards forming a shield around him. Elijah grabbed a fallen rifle, raised it. 3 shots. 3 guards down. Langley stumbled back, his calm expression finally cracking. You don't get to walk away from this, Elijah growled. Langley reached for a gun. Elijah didn't hesitate. He tackled him. The 2 men hit the runway hard, rolling across the pavement. Langley lashed out, trying to claw away. Elijah grabbed him by the collar, slamming him down. You sold out your own country, Elijah snarled. You tried to start a war in our backyard. You think I'm letting you go? Langley spat blood, laughing. You think this stops anything? There are others. Men like me. You'll never kill us all. Elijah pressed his forearm against Langley's throat. I don't have to kill you. The sound of FBI sirens cut through the air. Just gotta make sure you rot in a cell for the rest of your life. Langley's face twisted in rage, but it didn't matter, because it was over. The end of the line. The FBI swarmed the airstrip, rounding up survivors. Langley was hauled to his feet, his expensive suit now stained with blood and dust. Agent Daniels approached, giving Elijah an approving nod. "You got him." Elijah exhaled. "Took long enough." Langley was dragged toward a waiting SUV, his eyes burning with pure hatred. "You think this is the end?" he shouted. "You think you saved anyone?" Elijah smirked. "I think you'll enjoy federal prison." Langley was shoved into the car, his empire crumbling. Kara stepped beside Elijah, watching the scene. "You know," she said, "you could retire after this. Call it a win." Elijah chuckled. "Yeah." He turned toward the highway stretching ahead. "But there's always another fight." Kara shook her head. "You're impossible." Elijah smiled. "And you're still here." She smirked. "Yeah, guess I like impossible." The two of them walked away, leaving the past behind. Because the future was calling, and Elijah was ready.